Hello and welcome to today's video, and before we get started, let's address the elephant in the room. You may call this a router. I call it a router. You may call them potatoes. I call them spuds. You might call them tomatoes. I call them underripe ketchup. And you may call it yogurt when I call it dodgy milk. We all call things by different names. So if you're watching this video, you are going to hear me call this a router several times. And I know some of you are going to absolutely lose it in the comments. But please, stay with me a little bit. We all pronounce things different. But ultimately, you know what I'm talking about and I know what you're talking about. And that's what's most important. Roll the beginning. Hello, and that is right. Today we are comparing these two routers from Synology and QNAP. This isn't the first time I've compared these two brands side by side. However, when I have compared them, there always seems to be a consistent trend between them when it comes to any kind of new tech or any new revision. Generally, we find that in terms of hardware, QNAP come first. They arrive on the market with the latest hardware. They arrive there with the hardware more typically at a better price point, and a little while later, months or sometimes more than a year, Synology arrive with the same hardware, but they do it in a little bit more of a polished way. And for many people, choosing between them comes between getting the latest tech or waiting for it to get a little bit of shine, a little bit of polish, and that's kind of where things always seem to land between these two brands. Now, in today's video, this is part one of a two-part series where we're going to compare these two routers. Now, this part is going to be about the hardware. We're going to look at the wireless capabilities and the wired capabilities and the internal hardware of these two routers to see how they compare and ultimately help you understand about the value and which one's hopefully giving you the best bang for your buck. In part two, which if it is live should be linked in the description, we will be talking about their individual software because they both arrive with router management software and their handling of Wi-Fi 6 bandwidth via a single device or maybe even two or three, depending on how we set up the test for that part. We've already recorded the software overview, but the testing is still in progress. You can probably hear the NAS just off camera that we were using for that to kind of connect to via 2.5G. But with these two, when we want to talk about the hardware between them, I think it's very important straight away while looking at them to see that they have gone very different ways. Now, let's look at first the QNAP. This is the Qhora-301W. This is this device here, their Wi-Fi 6 router. Not just Wi-Fi 6 either, Wi-Fi 6, 10 gigabit Ethernet, and the smaller of the two. It arrives with 8 antennas inside dotted around the device there. It is a dual band router which will come in useful later on and is rated at AX3600. That means that with a shared bandwidth across its dual band architecture of 2.5 and 5 gigahertz and support of 80 megahertz and 160 megahertz channels, which I'll explain later on, this device can achieve 3,600 shared megabits of bandwidth, or around 360 megabytes, depending on the packets and of course the data you transmit. So this device, we looked on Newegg at the most recent pricing for these two devices, and at the time of recording, this is knocking around for about $349 to $379. Okay, so this device, as mentioned, has got the 8 antennas inside. That 160 megahertz channel there, again, you knock that into the 5 gigahertz band there, you're getting some good coverage. It can support in that single connected user a wireless connection of 1.2 gigabits per second. That's 120 megabytes, a fraction higher than a standard 1 GBE port there. Inside, you can create with the software 6 individual SSIDs, and you can also create multiple virtual networks, VLANs, inside that software to allow you to create a lot of different network configurations that suit your home or business needs. Now, we'll get on to the wired connections later on, but that's really what makes up this router's Wi-Fi 6 configuration. So now we move over to the RT6600. Now, the RT6600, as mentioned, arrived on the scene just recently. Just in case you can't count, it has 6 antennas, and all of these antennas are external, not internal. Now again, on Newegg, we looked this device up and the price was fluctuating over the course of 24 hours because it's just been released and stock level isn't hugely, abundant. It's knocking around for about $299 to about $349, but that's quite extreme there at the end. Now, those 6 antennas there comprise this system within a tri-band system. It has one 2.4 gigahertz network and 2 5 gigahertz network, and one of them is particularly impressive. Now, it is rated as an AX6600 router there. That means this device, across its shared bandwidth, can support almost double what this can across its entire connected bandwidth. That's right, 6,600 megabits per second there. Now, that's made possible in a few ways, not just because it's tri-band, but also because this router at the time of release is one of, if not the only, commercial available router that can take advantage of the 5.9 gigahertz band. Now, I mentioned this in my review, but long story short, most routers have access to the bulk of the 5 gigahertz band, but certain different frequencies, like little portions of the individual frequencies, are restricted for different use, from military to governmental use to shipping forecast, you name it. But the 5.9 gigahertz was always used for transportation communication. Now, this has been eased very recently because it was so useful to a lot of wireless communication, particularly in the case of routers and internet bandwidth consumption in the home and office environments, that it became eligible and then eventually able to be used for routers. And Synology, as I mentioned, is one of the first, if not the first, to have access to it. Once you take advantage of that and the 160 megahertz channel there, because again, they both support 160 megahertz channels per device if your client supports it, which most modern Wi-Fi 6 devices do, the result is that that single connection can give you 2.4 gigahertz. Remember, 1.2 gigabits per second on this, and this has got 2.4 gigabits per second. So again, that means a single connection on this is going to be much faster with this. Now, bear in mind that 2.4 gigabits per second connection there, wireless potential, which we showed in our software revision when we were connecting to this device, 160 megahertz channels take up a lot of room on the spectrum. You can only have 3 of them active on this at once, but nonetheless, that's still an enormous amount of potential thanks to the tri-band architecture of it and support of that 5.9 gigahertz there, thanks to the dual 5 gigahertz band there. Now, it does support multiple SSIDs. It supports up to 15 per setup on this, as well as multiple LANs. I believe you can create up to 5 virtual LANs or just total 5 networks within the system, and you can bind individual ports, individual SSIDs to those networks. Now, that is indeed possible on the QNAP system, but not to the same volume, not to 15, and not to that greater degree of available bandwidth there. So when it comes down to it, when it comes to wireless architecture between them, yes, the Qhora-301W has been on the market a year and a half longer than the QNAP, and it has advantages in other ways that we'll talk about later on. But when it comes to wireless coverage, both in Wi-Fi 6 and just general blanket coverage, one cannot help but completely point at the Synology being the greater of the two. And also bear in mind that it's arriving at a lower price tag. Another thing I thought I would never say on a Synology versus QNAP video, that the Synology would be markedly lower in price. That's something that very rarely happens in these comparisons. Next up, let's talk about design, because if you move away from the idea of just design, with wireless connectivity and internal and external routers, which again, we're not going to judge these two on, because let's face it, they have their own advantages and disadvantages. But if we talk about just simple design between these two devices, again, something I thought I would never say on a QNAP versus Synology video, the QNAP is a lot, I would say, more understated. It's a lot more discreet. This device is considerably more kind of subtle between the two of them, something I never thought I would say in a Synology versus QNAP comparison. It's got LEDs based there on the front of the device. There's plenty of ventilation on either side, a huge amount on the base. The system doesn't look like it can be wall mounted, which is a bit of a shame, I think, for a lot of kind of remote deployment users, but it's incredibly discreet and small with a wide variety of ports that we're going to talk about in a moment, all located there on the back. Now, we move away from that rather subtle, understated design, and it's kind of a brushed white steel effect there on the front, and we look at the Synology. And the Synology, for want of a better word, is aggressive as hell. Look at it. I mean, we talked a lot about modern routers, and particularly modern gaming routers in the last year or so. This thing's massive. Just to put it into perspective, let's bring that closer to camera and put these side by side. Put that there. Actually get them in the right hands. Even top down, side by side, between the two of them, the QNAP can be hidden behind the Synology, which is insane. Now, again, bear in mind, all 8 antennas are inside that device. It doesn't use the high kind of aggressive coverage antennas on this, which are advantageous, but still nonetheless, for small deployments or more portable deployments, or for those lacking space, this is gonna take up a lot of room. Now, these can be moved in, of course, but it's still going to be a big bugger to have around. Now, ventilation, there is tons of ventilation around the Synology, all the way around the edges there, all the way along the bottom. There's fewer ports that we'll talk about later on there on the front. There's a couple of buttons there for wireless and WPS configuration kind of changes there on the fly. But I think in terms of design, it's really going to come down to what you like. I can't really tell you which one of these two is better in terms of design. I can tell you that there are different scenarios where one is going to be much better to deploy in your home or business environment more than another. But I'd say right now, in terms of sheer, subtle, understated design, the QNAP looks sleeker. It looks a little bit like an old-style ISP router, let's be honest, but it's certainly the more understated and discreet. And given both of them, and neither one of them have fans, noise isn't going to be a question. And if you're going to be in close proximity, or you're not going to be taking advantage of that 5.9 160 megahertz for, channel and band, then this might be the one for you. However, this is aggressive for a reason. It has to be this big for a reason. It has to spread out that ventilation for a reason. And let's face it, some people just think that black tech looks nicer, it looks sleeker, the brushed effect, they're both plastic, but some people think white plastic looks cheap. And let's face it, they're both plastic chassis, so again, design is going to come down to you and which one you think looks nice, not just to your mind's eye or to your eye's eye, but also which is going to look better in your home or office. Next up, let's talk about ports and connections, because this is where we definitely saw between these two devices them not only change lanes, but the QNAP decide where its priority is. Clearly, they included Wi-Fi 6 a year and a half ago for a good reason, and they knew people would want Wi-Fi 6. But one of the main reasons people go for this router, and I think if you're finding this video and you already know about the Qhora, you know what I'm about to say. This system, it arrives with 4 LAN ports, fairly standard, 1 gigabit Ethernet there, so let's write home about it. We've got a couple of USB 3 ports there, so we can attach, additional storage, and I'll get onto that in a bit. It's got a WPS button, it's got the little power unit there, but you know what it's got there? It's got 2 10 gigabit Ethernet ports. That's, or shared WAN or LAN, depending on your setup. That is crazy town. So this system has lesser Wi-Fi connectivity than most current gen Wi-Fi 6 routers that are pushing that 160 band, and Synology's 5.9 gigahertz channel adoption is going to be hugely advantageous. But this is the only router I know that has Wi-Fi 6 over 8 antennas and a couple of 10 gigabit Ethernet ports there on the rear. This is a 10 gig router, and they even sprung for the two of them. Now, I don't know many people that have 10 gigabit internet, but I do know plenty of people that have got 10 gigabit NAS, and I know a lot of people that will use a 10 gigabit switch and a 10 gigabit NAS with this system as the router and therefore managing the internet as well, all in a continued single package. Now, the Synology, on the other hand, it's got its dedicated WAN port there, which is 1 gigabit Ethernet, and it's got 4 other LAN ports here, and one of them is a combined WAN and LAN, and this bad boy is a 2.5 gigabit Ethernet port as well. So a number of you might be going, cool, I don't have a 10 gigabit internet connection, that's madness. What is it, Silicon Valley? Get out. But you might have greater than gigabit, or somewhere between 1 to 2 to 2.5 gigabit, which is quite nice. However, this is where this system disappointed me. And if you've watched my reviews, you know what I'm going to say. One, I don't like the fact there's only one 2.5 gigabit Ethernet port there. I also don't like that that's not automatically the WAN port. Now, yes, you can set that port up as a WAN or a LAN if you choose, which is all fair and good. However, most people, including myself, complain that only one 2.5 gigabit Ethernet port there forces the end user to make a difficult choice. If you have a greater than gigabit Ethernet connection, you obviously want to funnel it into that. However, from there, that means all the other devices are now limited to 1 gigabit. So only having the one port on there, it's great if you're going to use a 2.5G NAS, and a lot of people were keen to point out, why didn't they slam on a 10 gig port? But having one port on there is a little disappointing. Also on top of that, there's a USB port there, and there's good and bad news here that I'm going to talk about in a moment, but there's only one port. Why only one? If you look at the RT6600 that came before this, some 3 to 4 years earlier at least, that router had 2 USB ports. Yes, one of them was a USB 2, but this system does an enormously impressive job of managing USB accessories there, and I'll get onto that in a moment. But the predecessor also had an SD card slot, which this doesn't have. So in terms of ports and connections, this marginally improves things over the RT2600 that came before in terms of physical connections, but is woefully less than what you're seeing in that Qhora there. Now, I said I'd talk about USB a little bit there. I do think it's worth highlighting why I'm particularly disappointed at this only having one USB port overall. Now, the reason for it is that the USB port on the QNAP can be used to add a USB drive, and you can access it via FTP. There's not a vast amount more you can do with it. There's a few small compatible accessories, but it's quite limited. It's very router specific, and interacting with the storage inside isn't exactly brain-meltingly fantastic. It doesn't feel incredibly fluid, and it certainly doesn't feel like you're in a kind of NAS architecture device, which it really shouldn't, maybe, because it's a router. Now, the Synology, on the other hand, that USB port not only allows you to attach your mobile phone for mobile tethering, so you can have a failover internet connection with a mobile phone or a USB dongle. There's not a lot supported though, to be honest. But on top of that, if you add a USB drive, it gives you pretty much every single feature of File Station. So again, full fluid file management within the web browser. It gives you access to copy, paste, sharing, expiry date, sharing rules, shared folder creation, and I know this is all software stuff, but it's relevant. Also use Download Station. Also, you can use the mobile apps in with it as well. Why am I saying all this? Because this device here, having 2 USB ports, doesn't make it better than this device's 1 USB port, because this device does more with it, with the USB port. And if anything, I would have got rid of maybe a few LAN ports because I really like storage, but that's just me. But overall, I think we have to all agree that when it comes to physical connections, this bad boy wins. Yes, the USB may be a little less useful than you see in the Synology router there, but this system arriving with those 2 10 gigabit Ethernet ports pretty much rules the day. And I think a number of you who want to use this for a greater than gigabit internet connection, because you may have some, substantially more than 2.5G, you lucky dog, or you just want to use a 10G NAS and a 10G switch and make sure a bunch of 1 gig users all get full saturation. This router allows that to happen. And both of these routers, although they have switch architecture in a number of ways with the virtual LAN and greater than gigabit connectivity in places, ultimately, in terms of physical connections, the Qhora absolutely storms it. Now, I want to end today's hardware comparison video just talking a little bit about the CPU and memory, because although I want to touch on it, it's not hugely relevant. It's more about how the system handles rather than how much oomph there is inside, because they're both using ARM-based processors there. Now, the newer CPU of the two, and certainly the more proficient one might argue, is the Qualcomm inside the QNAP there. It's a quad-core 2.2 GHz processor there, and again, they've had to have gone a bit beefier because of that 10 GBE connection. It also arrives with a gig of DDR3 memory inside. Neither of them allow upgrades. Now, there's a quad-core Qualcomm processor and 1 gig of memory inside the Synology, but it's a quad-core 1.8 GHz. It's a different architecture CPU there, and again, they've definitely prioritized the wireless frequency there. Now, bear in mind, remember, that utilization of 5.9 GHz and the additional band there, that extra 5 GHz connection there, results in this router being just a great deal busier with Wi-Fi connections. Indeed, when we opened up the system, and indeed when we saw early details of the internal specifications, we saw that whereas the QNAP there with its 8 antennas are funneling into 2 different controllers for the 2.4 and 5 GHz, this has those 3 individual Qualcomm controllers, network controllers, and the additional internal central Qualcomm CPU there. So between the two of them, it's one of the arguments one might make against acceleration and top speed. The QNAP certainly has more power under the bonnet, but the Synology has the option there to get faster straight off the bat overall. And when choosing between these two, at least in terms of hardware, because I do recommend you hold tight for my software comparison, that the Synology is clearly the better choice for wireless connections. For Wi-Fi 6, if you are buying this router for Wi-Fi 6, and that's your primary raison d'etre in terms of hardware and coverage and stuff like that, the Synology wins the Wi-Fi 6 router battle here, if there is such a thing. The tri-band connectivity, the increased support of the 5.9 GHz frequency there, allowing you more 160 MHz channels utilizations, the larger degree of SSID creation. It's unquestionably the better wireless connected device there. And again, it goes up to 6.6 gigabits per second of wireless connection there. Whereas the QNAP, wired-wise and Ethernet-wise, unbeatable. Its Wi-Fi 6 is fair to middling. It's what I would expect. The Wi-Fi 6 support on this is pretty much on par with most other routers, apart from obviously some more aggressive routers that have got the outside antenna, which have got an element of flexibility there. But in terms of wired connectivity with those 2 10 gigabit Ethernet ports and a beefier CPU inside to keep things moving, this is the router for people that want to have Wi-Fi 6. They want to have it. But they know that their priorities are Ethernet. They know their priorities are the local area network, and particularly wired local area network. But as I say, stay tuned for the software comparison between these two, where we look at QRouter versus SRM, because these two, once again, have gone very different directions in how they present their solutions to you, and the software is a big indicator of that. But otherwise, I hope you've enjoyed this comparison so far. It's a long video, but hopefully the chapters at the bottom will help you along the way. Again, click like if you've enjoyed the video. Ever since they got rid of the usability of dislike, it's the only way we can understand as YouTubers what we're doing right. So by clicking like, I know what I'm doing right. If you don't, then I know I'm doing it wrong. If you click subscribe, you'll be the first to find out when the next part in this series and other videos on these two brands and data storage in general are released. In the description, there's links towards where you can buy these two items. And again, if you're thinking about buying them, it helps us if you use those clicks, because then it supports what we're doing here. But other than that, why not take advantage of the free advice service over on NAS Compares? It's linked in the description. It's genuinely free. It's answered by me and Eddie the web guy. We're trying to put together a big community thing now where other people are answering the questions. And then on top of that, from there, there's donate buttons. Use them, ignore them, couldn't care less. It's up to you. It's a pay forward service. We're doing that because people helped us. Why don't you do the same? Other than that, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you on the next video.